All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and start. So everybody, thank you for coming to this presentation about women's suffrage in Muncie. Before I introduce Melissa, our guest speaker, I just want to go over a few housekeeping things. When you entered the Zoom meeting, you should have been muted upon entry, but please make sure that you stay muted just so that we don't interrupt the presentation. We'll save questions for the end of the presentation, but if you think of something and you don't want to forget, you can just go ahead and type it in the chat and I'll monitor those and we can ask Melissa at the end. Or we can wait at the very end too and I'll unmute and then you can ask your questions directly. It doesn't really matter. We just want to wait until the end of the presentation. I will also have a resource guide that I'll share for local sources, and Melissa said that she's also created something that we'll email out later. So without further ado, let me present Melissa Gentry, who is the Map Collection Supervisor at the GIS Research and Map Collection within Ball State University Libraries. That is a mouthful.
Yeah, it is.
There, she provides instruction programs and curates special exhibits for Ball State University and the Muncie community. Since 2008, Melissa has been a featured instructor for the Cornerstone Center for the Arts, providing workshops and programs for Black, Women's, and Native American History Months and other topics. Furthermore, she presented a Women's History session for the Hoosier Women at Work Conference in 2018, the Indiana Association of Historians in 2019, and the Midwestern History Conference in 2018. She's included in the Library of Congress Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission database and credits her interest in women's history to her grandmother, who worked for Indiana Senator Birch Bayh during his legislative battles for Title IX and the ERA. And with that, I will turn this presentation over to her.
Okay, thanks everyone. Hi, Sophia. So as some of you know, I work at the Ball State Library. We just say map collection when we answer the phone. It's a lot easier than that big long title. But in the spring of 2018, I started working with the women from Minnetrista, the Muncie Public Library, Sarah McKinley, and the Delaware County Historical Society. And we created this Notable Women Committee, and our goal was to find 100 notable women in Muncie history that people may not know the stories about them. And
Melissa, I think you fuzzed out a minute.
What?
I think you fuzzed out a little bit, like it froze a minute. Did everybody hear her? You can type in the chat just to make sure. Yes, okay. That might have just been me. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, so basically what we're doing is we just discover a woman just from any means. Like usually I just use newspapers.com and we look up a name, find as much information as we can about them, and we add them to our little database. And then ideally we're going to create, like right now we have just kind of a basic web page with some just brief biographies. But ideally, we want to implement projects with Ball State students and even Muncie Central students to create interesting biographies or maybe even almost historical fiction about some of these women, just do some creative projects. I've even talked to some art professors. So this project, the Suffrage Project, is basically part of that Notable Women, where I'm just discovering women and trying to tell their story in some way. And the ultimate project, the ultimate product for this project will be an Omeka page, an exhibit page that has story maps and photography and oral history and films, just anything we can find about these women. So right now we're just kind of, even after 2 years, just still digging up people's names and finding these stories. And just in the last 2 weeks, I found about 20 new women that I've added to the list. So you can imagine it's almost like a rabbit hole that you find these women. So I'll go ahead and get started with some of the suffrage stories about the Muncie women. These are some of the women I've discovered so far. I find these group photos and I always look on the back of the photograph to see if I can find any names of people that we haven't found. The Ball State Digital Media Repository, which is on the homepage of the library webpage, it's just a treasure trove. You can get on there and just flip through thousands of photographs. You can limit your search, but I just love looking at all these different pictures. And this is a good example. This elect Mildred Smith, we found this picture and now we're on this mission to figure out who was Mildred Smith. And you can imagine with a name like Smith, it's been kind of difficult to find anything. A lot of people have different opinions about the sign, that the banner that she has, what it says. It seems to be some kind of tags that they're selling. We think it says buy tags today. But again, we need some more background about that and who is Mildred Smith and who are some of these women in the picture. So those are some of the dilemmas that I'm dealing with. And when you're studying women's history, another drawback is that a lot of times the women are listed in the newspaper with their husband's name. So like Mrs. Hugh Cowing is a good example of one. So you have to find the man's obituary and see if his wife's name is in the obituary, or over in the archives, they have city directories, and in the city directory, it will have the man's name and then the wife's name in parentheses. So you can imagine just all the setbacks that you have when you're studying women's history. But this is one of the first maps that I made about Indiana suffrage history. And I was using kind of a metaphor of a firefly, because when you're reading about women's suffrage in Indiana and actually just across the United States, it's like a firefly. A light will come on and something good will happen and you'll make progress, and then the light goes off and you take 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. So I started noticing that. So I've been using the firefly theme on some of these maps, and you can see there's a lot of history all over the map of Indiana. A lot of people think of the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. It was actually held in a chapel in New York in July of 1848. And a lot of people think of that as like the launching of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. But if you remember back to the Revolutionary days, Abigail Adams actually wrote a letter urging her husband to remember the ladies when they were meeting with the Continental Congress. So I kind of think of that as the beginning of women's suffrage. And that was also the first time that women were ignored, because he ignored Abigail's urging in that letter. So another thing about Seneca Falls is a lot of people associate Susan B. Anthony as the mother of women's suffrage, but Susan B. Anthony didn't even attend the meeting at Seneca Falls. She was not in attendance. So that's another kind of fun fact. And they actually took a vote on 11 resolutions at that meeting, and the one resolution for giving women the right to vote barely passed. It only passed after Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton basically gave these fiery speeches begging people to vote for it. So that's another kind of interesting little history that a lot of people think that Seneca Falls, they just wanted women's suffrage. They really didn't. That was one of the resolutions that they barely passed at their meeting. One of the things that came out of that was Horace Greeley. He was a popular newspaper man. He actually voiced his support for equal rights for women. And it would be newspapers that would be critical to the changing of the opinion for women's suffrage. And I found kind of a surprising article in the Muncie Morning News where they actually supported suffrage, because most of the newspapers mocked women's suffragists. They a lot of times wrote entire articles where it became like a big joke. They did not take it seriously. But I found this in the Muncie Morning News that was kind of hopeful. It says, indeed, the women, in spite of press and ridicule, have stormed a good many well-manned forts and broken down a good many prejudices. They've reached the Rubicon of their hopes, that is suffrage at the polls, and there is no doubt that they will cross this before another half-decade passed. We should not be surprised if it is a factor in the next 2 presidential elections. Unfortunately, that was written in January 21st, 1880. So as you know, it would actually be 40 years later that the women actually did get the right to vote. It would be, there'd be setbacks from war. There were breweries that opposed women's suffrage, because a lot of the women who were suffragists were interested in prohibition. And so the breweries opposed women's suffrage because they thought that women would vote against saloons. There were actually anti-saloon leagues. There were clergymen that were against it. There would be setbacks with epidemics, which we're very familiar with now. And mostly it was just male politicians. You see on this picture here, that's the Indiana legislature. And it's just basically white males, and they opposed women's suffrage for various reasons. A lot of it is just control. World War I was a setback, but at the same time, this is kind of a good example of the firefly. It was a setback, but it also helped women because they volunteered and they served in World War I in various capacities. And so that kind of actually changed people's opinions of what women were capable of doing. And the history of Indiana suffrage alone goes back way back. So Seneca Falls was in 1848, and they actually had a women's rights convention in Indiana in 1851. And these are just some of the early pioneers that I have pictured here. Most of them were Quakers, most of them were abolitionists, and most of them were from East Central Indiana. So it's kind of interesting that suffrage started around Richmond, where the Quaker community was, and up through Muncie. So it was the eastern part of the state where the suffrage rights actually began. But this is how newspapers portrayed suffragists. So you can see it's not a very flattering look here. And I actually found in the South Bend Tribune that went along with this cartoon, they were talking about women going out to the polls, and they said the trouble with these women canvassers for votes, they are too apt to lose sight of the North Star of reform and sink into discussions of yeast for sandwiches, sweeping with brooms, and embroidery stitches. There's going to be trouble at the polls too. No nice woman is going to cast her vote disturbed by the fear that her hat is crooked or her hair is out of curl. And it's going to cost a lot of money to fit up each voting booth with a looking glass, a gas jet curling iron, and a powder box. So, and that was pretty typical. That was in a South Bend newspaper, but I found a lot of articles where they talked about suffragists, and they seemed to believe that it was only single women that wanted suffrage, and they wanted it to meet male politicians. So it was very kind of an insulting coverage from the newspapers. Some of the national leaders, like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and obviously Susan B. Anthony, campaigned for suffrage across the country. And Susan B. Anthony actually visited Indiana several times, but I made this map in reference to some visits that she did in the fall of 1887. She basically was going to travel to each of the congressional districts in Indiana and give speeches. And she was traveling with Helen Yauger, who was kind of a rebellious suffragist from Lafayette, a troublemaker, you would say, and Zerelda Wallace, who was the former First Lady of Indiana. She was in the tour. And then May Wright Sewell, who was an educator from Indianapolis. And it was kind of an interesting mix because Susan B. Anthony was fairly conservative, although she did go to, she attempted to vote in 1871 and was arrested. And that inspired Helen Gauger to go to vote in 1894. And she was also arrested in Indiana. So she was kind of I'd say middle of the road suffragist. Helen Gauger would be probably an extremist. And then May Wright Sewell was, again, very conservative. So, and you'll notice that a lot in Indiana, there's a nice balance between the more progressive suffragists and sometimes they're even described as militant in relation to like the suffragettes in Great Britain, and then the more conservative suffragists. So Susan B. Anthony would be more middle of the road. And by the time she came on this congressional tour, this is not what she looked like. This is actually the Susan B. Anthony of 1887. So she was about 67 years old by the time she got here. And unfortunately, her appearance would be part of the news. And they described her, instead of calling her the mother of the women's suffrage movement, they called her the father of the women's suffrage movement. And one newspaper in LaPorte actually said that she spoke in a decidedly manly way, which cannot help but challenge the admiration. So again, they're concerned with her appearance. But when Susan B. Anthony came to Muncie, that was one of her stops on the tour, she had a committee that actually picked her up at the train station, and she stayed at the Kirby Hotel, which you can see right in the middle of this map. It's right on the corner of Main Street and Jefferson Street. And a lot of these places we're going to put on a walking tour of Muncie suffrage. So you can walk around Muncie. Unfortunately, Muncie has this history of demolishing beautiful buildings. So a lot of the buildings are gone, but it's still kind of, you can just take a quiet moment and think of what used to be there. And we're going to post pictures of the buildings that were actually there. So she stayed at the Kirby House Hotel. And then she was going to appear at the High Street Methodist Church. It's right there on the corner of High Street and Adams Street. So this is just a little bit further down than the High Street Church is today. And she presented an afternoon and evening program. This was just after Thanksgiving in 1887. And the Muncie Daily Times encouraged attendance to its readers, both men and women. And they said whether you're in favor of her cause or not, that you should go and hear her because it would be brilliant, entertaining, and instructive. And if you're familiar with the Thomas Neely restaurant, Thomas Neely was one of the Muncie City founders, and he kept a diary every day. And the Ball State Archives has copies of the Thomas Neely diaries. And he actually wrote on this day in 1887 that they were hosting a big suffrage meeting at the Methodist Church, and his daughter Jenny attended this meeting. The day after the program, and here's the location of the church again, it was printed in the paper. Reverend Mr. Kemp, presiding elder of the church, opened the exercises by leading the large congregation assembled in singing "My Country 'Tis of Thee" and in prayer. Susan B. Anthony was introduced and spoke from the subject, disenfranchisement, a degradation. She declared that beggars always compelled not to be choosers, whether be for bread or for ballot. And it went on and said, Miss Susan B. Anthony, in a most practical and pleasant manner, urged the women to organize an effort to secure this modicum of power that is within the hands of the next legislature to grant. And again, it was not in the next legislature. It would be 33 years after this that women in Indiana would get the right to vote. But after spending 2 days in Muncie, Anthony and her entourage headed for Anderson for the next stop on the program. And she basically just presented the same program, just in different cities. So the Muncie suffrage history actually goes back even before Susan B. Anthony visited. And these are some pictures of some of the women who were the first graduates of the very first class that graduated from the Muncie Central Academy. And the Muncie Central Academy goes on to become Muncie Central High School. But after the Civil War, that was the first time that high schools actually started having graduations. It was typically reserved just for college classes. So the Muncie Central Academy decided they were going to grade all of the students that they had in their classes. It didn't go by your age, it was just by your ability. And so they gave tests and they did projects, and there were 7 women that qualified. None of the boys in the high school qualified to graduate in that first graduating class. And the 7 women that graduated in 1868, every one of them became a suffragist in some way, some more than others, but every single one of them became a suffragist. And I thought that was pretty amazing. And their principal, her name was Emma Montgomery McCrae, and she was also a suffragist. And this is way back in 1868. So I thought that was pretty fascinating that they were speaking about women's rights. And they each gave a commencement address, and a lot of them talk about women's equality, even in their commencement speeches back in 1868. So that was pretty awesome. And just for an example, the woman on the left in this picture is Louise Cassidy. She's Louise Nelson Cassidy. Cassidy is her married name. She goes on to become a suffragist, and in the summer of 1914, she actually printed off 4,500 brochures for suffrage and passed them out individually at the fair by herself. So she took action there. And then one of the other graduates was Ida Houston Harper, and we'll be talking more about her here in a second. But they actually had their classes in the basement of the St. John's Universalist Church. And again, this is a building that was torn down. If you're not familiar with where it's located, it's right on the corner of Madison Street and Jackson Street, and just a little bit south of like where the Cornerstone is. If you're familiar with this Cintas sign that has the mannequin in it, where the Mad Jacks is, that's where this church was. And you can see it's kind of in disrepair here in this picture, but I was just so excited to find this picture where it actually shows the Cintas guy in the picture with the church before they tore it down. But that church becomes critically important because that's where they have some of the early Women's Franchise League meetings too. So that will definitely be on the walking tour. Here's another picture of the congregation. You can see it was a beautiful church. Again, it's a shame it was torn down. And the graduation for the class of 1868 was in this place called Walling Hall. If you look closely at the Sanborn map, this is the courthouse is right next to the asterisk star here. And then you see the red circle. On the second floor was Walling Hall, and it was just an open hall where they hosted their graduation. And they had other celebratory events there related to suffrage. And both of those have since been torn down. Here's a better view of the Walling Hall here on the second floor. On the third floor, there was a harness shop. So it's kind of interesting. Here's a picture of Emma Montgomery McCrae, the principal, and she actually makes news related to women's suffrage. She actually testified in front of the United States House of Representatives in 1880 on behalf of women getting the right to vote. So Ida Husted Harper was the one graduate that I wanted to focus on. She graduated in 1868 at the age of 17. She went to IU for a year, and then she left and became a principal in Kokomo. So back in the day, you could just have a year of schooling and become a principal. She was actually qualified to become a principal when she graduated from the Muncie Central Academy. Then she ended up getting married, and she moved with her husband to Terre Haute. She became an editor of the newspaper in Terre Haute, and while in Terre Haute, she met Susan B. Anthony. Her daughter, Ida Husted Harper's daughter, Winnie, actually moved to California to attend Stanford. So Ida Husted Harper decided she would attend Stanford. So she moved to California with her daughter, was attending Stanford. She helped to get suffrage passed in California. This is around 1911. And then at that time, Susan B. Anthony chose her to become her biographer. So she wrote the biography of Susan B. Anthony, and then she co-authored with Susan B. Anthony the history of women's suffrage, which it's a huge, I think it's like 10 volumes of big, huge history of women's suffrage. And it's available here at Bracken Library if anybody ever wants to read through that. And I see Ida Husted Harper's house was torn down. She lived on the corner of Charles and Mulberry. This is what's there today. It's just a parking lot. So again, I think a lot of things on the walking tour, it's going to be you're walking by parking lots, but that's fine. Ida would be considered conservative on the suffrage spectrum, and she went next to New York in 1911 to work on their suffrage movement. And she actually published this article, and it was published in New York, but also in the Richmond newspaper. I found a copy of it, where she said that the women of New York, the suffragists of New York, were going to set back the cause of suffrage because of the way they dressed. She did not appreciate these tight dresses. And if you look closely in this picture, you can see the women's shoes. And Ida thought that that was scandalous, that you could see women's shoes. So she wrote an entire article about it. And I'll read you just part of it. She says, "Nothing has done so much harm to suffrage in the last 50 years as the way women have dressed or undressed. No woman who enters a great movement can allow herself the same freedom she enjoyed before. She is no longer responsible merely as an individual. She is the embodiment of the cause that she represents. If she is a suffragist, whatever silly thing that she does is charged to suffrage by men. Their hats alone," she did not like these hats, "their hats alone have made them the laughing stock of the country. These ridiculous objects are without excuse in either their shape or trimming, and they are made worse by the wearing of long hat pins, which have been such a menace to others that legal relief has been sought." So apparently long hat pins are dangerous. She goes on to say, "The most influential women have worn dresses on the street in public places that have exposed figures. They've exposed arms. They've exposed bosoms and ankles in so shameless a way that one is forced to suspect that if these suffragists have appeared modest in the past, it was only because custom demanded it and not from any innate refinement." So Ida was very fired up about the fashion. She actually comes back to Muncie in 1918. This is their class reunion photo in 1918, and this was actually taken at one of the ball homes. And all of the ball homes will be on the suffrage tour. They were all involved in the suffrage movement. And this is just an article about Ida Husted Harper. And if you read her commencement address from that 1918 graduation ceremony at Muncie Central High School, it's really depressing because she talks about how women are on the verge of getting the right to vote. And so she tells the women in the audience, you should go out, you should get a banner, and you should protest for women's suffrage just so you can join the movement, because pretty soon we're going to have the vote and we won't need to protest anymore. And whenever I talk about this in classes at Ball State, after I tell that story, I ask the women in the classes, how many of you are registered to vote? And sadly, and hopefully this is changing now, but in the past, it's been, I would say, about 10% of the women at Ball State had registered to vote. So it's kind of depressing that Ida Houston Harper thought that we were so close to having this, you know, redemption, and really young women we're still not really participating the way that we should. So I always think that's kind of depressing that she made that speech. And this is one of the quotes that I pulled out of her speech. It required courage, she said back in those days, to be a suffragist, and it requires courage nowadays not to be one. So that was from her commencement address in 1918. So if we skip along back to the kind of the birth of the Women's Franchise League in Indiana, it started forming from different organizations around 1912. And Muncie actually documented it in the newspaper. They had a woman from there was this organization called the Federated Clubs. So basically, if you were in the women's club, or they had poetry clubs or art clubs or music clubs, you could join this thing called the Federated Club, where it was all the women, all the club women together. And the president of that in Indiana was this Mrs. McWhirter. And she came to Muncie, and she suggested that they start organizing a franchise league. And so about 200 women came to her speech, and they decided to start organizing. And so there were a lot of different events that spring and summer of 1912. One of them was hosted at the Muncie Public Library, and they organized kind of a committee, and they chose different women to serve on the committee. And the committee was, I'll read you the names, these are just some of the women that I'm interested in researching more. One of them was Susan Ryan Marsh, which we're going to talk about her in a minute. Carrie Hageman, and her name will come up again. Emma Wood Ball, she was married to one of the Ball brothers. Sarah Crossfield, and then Lindy Llewellyn Douglas White. So that was the committee, and I'm going to do some more research on some of those women. And then another organizing committee was actually hosted by William and Emma Ball at, I think my slides are out of order here, let me see, at the Maplewood. We'll come back to that. At the Maplewood House. It's the red brick ball house with the white pillars. And it was kind of like, they called it an organizing meeting, and it was kind of interesting because they started out talking about educational reform and how food safety and child labor laws and all the things that women thought that they would be voting for. But then by the end of the evening, they were singing songs, and actually William Ball Jr. Was dancing and performing skits, and Dr. Lucius Ball showed up, and he actually joined the Women Franchise League. So that sounded more kind of like a pep rally instead of an organizing meeting. So this is Susan Ryan Marsh, and she was on that organizing committee. She started attending city council meetings so that she could learn about things that they would be voting for. And Susan was an artist. She was a musician. She wrote articles for the newspaper, multi-talented. This is her house. It still exists. If you go to the Thomas Neely restaurant, it's right across the street at 616 East Adams Street. And we're actually, this house was just resold to a new owner. We had been consulting with the previous owner about getting a historical marker there, because if you look closely at the house on that third floor, that was her studio. And they used to have like a kind of a cultural center there where people would meet to paint, to discuss different societal issues. So it was kind of a little cultural center right there on East Adams Street. And then her father's house was right around the corner, and you can see there. So we have Susan Ryan's house. The southernmost little suffragist here would be the Thomas Neely house. Jenny Neely was a suffragist. Right across the street is Susan Ryan Marsh. Right catty corner from her house was her father's house, and it was also an art center. And then behind that house was their previous house. So it's almost like a little strip of the Ryan Marsh family. This is her father's house, and it's still there today. You can see it there today. This is the inside of that house. And this is what it looks like today. So it's just right. And then if you walk across this parking lot, that you would get to Susan Ryan Marsh's house. And then this house back here that you see is kind of beat up behind, that's their old house. So that whole little strip there could be like a historical marker for suffrage. And then the Ball family, I was just discussing Emma Wood Ball. The Ball family sponsored a lot of the early organizing meetings and the pep rallies, and they provided food and, like I said, entertainment. So they were very much involved in the organizing of the Women's Franchise League in Muncie. And this is the Maplewood House, where they had that very first official meeting that broke into song and dance. So it's an important place on the suffrage map that we have. Then in July, so those all took place in May of 1912. And then in July of 1912, they had their first official meeting of the Women's Franchise League in Muncie. And it was held at the YWCA, which this is what the YWCA used to look like. And this would be located right behind where the YWCA is today. So if you want to see it on a map, it's just, so the YWCA is here, and it's just on the opposite corner behind it. So in women's suffrage history, the 1913 Washington, D.C. parade was very important. Unfortunately, Indiana only had 13 women who attended, and in the delegation, there was no one from Muncie. So I researched some of the women from the Indiana delegation, and that will be in the separate Indiana history map. But none of the women from Muncie attended. And I don't know if you guys know the sort of ending to that parade. This is the beautiful beginning, and it's a colorized photo that PBS colorized for The Vote, the documentary series that they created. But by the end of the parade, the men who had showed up for the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson began beating the women, and 300 of the women were hospitalized, and it was a lot of violence. And there were certain points in the parade where they actually had to march single file through these attacking men. So it reminded me of, it was very similar to the Women's March from 2017 with Trump's inauguration. It was almost like a protest march. That's what this was. It was a protest to Woodrow Wilson and for women's suffrage. And Alice Paul, she was the more militant suffragist leader as opposed to Susan B. Anthony. And she was the one who organized that parade. But the interesting thing is, on that very same day, there was also a parade in Indiana, and it was a march on the State House. And so there were only 13 women in Washington, D.C., but there were 500 suffragists that showed up at the Indiana State House. And it was really great because it was just a silent protest. They marched into the State House, and they started pinning suffrage pins or yellow flowers, which was the color of suffrage, on the lapels of legislators. Unfortunately, some of the legislators were harassing them and mocking them. Even the pages were harassing them, and the pages started taking the votes for women buttons, and they would mark out the WO, and it just said votes for men. So they're like pranking. But the good thing is there were several women from Muncie that actually attended this parade, including Susan Ryan Marsh. So that was some good news. By 1914, Muncie started hosting suffrage days, and they hosted these in the McCulloch Park. And a lot of times it was just a big picnic, and they would have speakers. And it's really fun if you go back into the old newspapers, and they'll print the entire text of the speeches. And it's really interesting. And Alexis, you'll like this. A lot of the librarians were speakers at these suffrage day parties. And it just looked like a lot of fun. And there were men, women, and children that participated, and franchise leagues from around the county and even from Union City and Gas City would come down to McCulloch Park, and they were big festivals. So that was kind of a bright light that was happening in McCulloch Park. This is a map of McCulloch Park. A lot of people don't realize that McCulloch Park was actually segregated, and there wasn't a franchise league in Muncie, but it was not established until 1917. So the early suffrage meetings that they were having for Suffrage Day were, as far as we can tell, only attended by white suffragists. This is where they had a national speaker come in for one of the picnics in McCulloch Park. And this is one of the quotes that I pulled out from one of the librarians. actually, this is one of the, a teacher that said, people sometimes say women have gained the right to vote, but she will lose her feminine modesty. But what is there about voting that will lessen her dignity? And again, this is something very typical where men didn't think it would be dignified for women to go to the voting booth. So she was arguing against that case. Then in 1915, this is, I think, kind of an exciting campaign that they started. They had across the country melting pots, and these were each franchise league had a pot, and they would post it somewhere. In Kentland, Indiana, they actually had a car, and they drove their car around with a pot in front of it, and they had people dropping their jewelry. You could put jewelry in there, you could put pins in there, anything that was gold, silver, you dropped in the pot. And this took place, they started in May, and it went through the middle of June. So you can see here's they're publicizing it here on the Indianapolis Star, the suffrage melting pot. So they're asking people to donate. And I looked up just to get an idea of how much they actually raised. The Bloomington melting pot raised about $400. That was the only figure that I can find in today's value. And this is Frances Grayson, and she's kind of an interesting suffragist from Muncie. She went to Columbia University. She was very educated, but she worked kind of as an actress slash showbiz personality, because later she becomes an aviatrix. And she actually joins that whole movement to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, she ends up crashing her plane off of Newfoundland, but she was quite a character, and she was actually President Wilson's niece. So she was involved in the 1915 Muncie Melting Pot Day, and she performed a dramatic skit, and she asked the people to donate their jewelry after her dramatic performance at the Melting Pot Day. So I had to include her in our suffrage presentation. But these are just some of the stories that they had about the suffrage day and the different things that they had. They had parades to go along with the melting pot, picnics. So it's just kind of a publicity stunt. The franchise league that had the most money, raised the most money, was actually, it was a tie between one from Indianapolis and one from Evansville. So these are some of the parades. This is actually a parade in Muncie. This was a temperance parade, but this was a suffragist float in the temperance parade. And again, those two issues were related. Most suffragists were in favor of temperance. Then in 1917, we kind of fast forward to 1917, the melting pot actually helped recruit members. And so we had a little over 200 members in the franchise league in Muncie. And in 1917, and it's really hard to see Emma Jean here, but this is Emma Jean Lesh. She's the second from the right in that photograph, and they're on the state house steps there. And they're very excited because in the winter of 1917, the Indiana legislature actually passed a partial suffrage bill. And it only said that women could vote for congressional delegates, but it was something. And so women were excited. So they set aside from June to August, there were certain days that you were allowed to register to vote. And the president of the Indiana Franchise League, Marie Edwards, suggested that women sign up to be a notary public. And then that way they could go around the county in cars, they could set up registration booths in different places. So like the melting pot that Muncie had, it was posted in the McNaughton store. And so for this suffrage time, they actually set up a table to register votes. And so I kind of looked into that, and Mr. McNaughton that built that department store, it was the biggest department store in Eastern Indiana. It was a huge department store, 5 stories tall. And his daughter was a suffragist. So he was supporting suffrage by allowing them to use his store. It was kind of interesting because they said that there would be a registration booth, and then they would be selling like face powder next to it. And they would tell the women, okay, the registration is going to be in the underwear department today. And then, so they'd go to register to vote while they were shopping. And a lot of times they did this just so they could avoid the flack that they would get from their husbands. So but there are actually 2 women. Electa Chase Murphy was one, And Carrie Hageman that we talked about, that was on the organizing committee earlier, they were notary publics, and they were the ones that were posted up by the shoe department, by the underwear department, in the McNaughton store, registering women to vote. And they were very excited. The Franchise League actually hired a woman named Orva Emerson, and she was a teacher, and she would come to the Franchise League meetings, and she would teach women about, now this is what you need to know to vote. And the exciting thing was there was an African American committee that went to the Women's Franchise League meeting in Muncie, and they said, we want to start a club. So they started, it was called the Booker T. Washington Suffrage Club. So they started that, and then they went to Whiteley, and at a church, they presented a meeting, and it was so welcome that men and women, hundreds of men, African-American men and women, started their own Whiteley Franchise League. So we had 2 African-American franchise leagues in Muncie that started during this, we call it the Summer of Registration in 1917, where they're registering as many women as they can to vote. And they think over 10,000 women in the county registered to vote in that short little span of a few months. So there's the McNaughton's store. And you could also go on the first day that you were allowed to register in person at the courthouse. You could go to the courthouse. This is the best picture I could find from that era, from the courthouse. And the Indianapolis Star actually did a story. They sent reporters around the state, and they did a story about who were the first women to officially register to vote in the county. So I looked it up for Muncie. Let me see if I can find the article here. Yeah, so it was the Indianapolis News, and it said the first 4 persons to register at Muncie on the first day were women, Mrs. Nellie Otto Reed, again giving her husband's name. She was one of the 2 registration clerks, so she was there to work, and so she registered first. And then Mrs. Margaret Harrison, and she was also a deputy clerk. She was second. But the one woman that was from the general public that registered, they told a story about her, and they said she was poorly but neatly dressed. She said to Mrs. Reed, "I want to register so I can vote, but I can't write. I can't even write my own name. Is there any way that it can be arranged so that I can vote even if I can't read or write?" And surely, said Mrs. Reed, who then filled out the registration blank for the woman, held her shaking hand while she made an X in place of her name, and then administered the oath to her. That done, the woman walked slowly away without saying another word. And they gave a lot of coverage that day too about how the women, when they were filling out the registration card, they didn't want to put their age down. And that was kind of a myth. They said there was only one woman in Muncie that when they asked her age, she said, "Oh, I'm old enough to vote." And they said, "No, you have to write it down." And so she took the registration form and ripped it up and left. She didn't want to give her age. But the newspapers always made a bigger deal out of that than it really was. So it was really only one woman. And the Muncie League actually ordered about 10,000 copies of brochures to pass out about how to vote. The sad thing is, though, in October, the Indiana Supreme Court declared that law unconstitutional. So the women were registered to vote. And again, it's that Firefly thing. They had the light of hope, and then it was taken away from them. And that kind of led into kind of a dark period. That summer of 1917, when women in Muncie were registering to vote, it actually started in January of 1917, but it started getting kind of literally, pardon the pun, heated in the summer of 1917. These were pickets that were happening outside the White House. And this again was organized by Alice Paul, that more militant suffragist. And she started in January, and the idea was that they were just going to picket right outside the White House gates until President Woodrow Wilson's second inauguration in March. But instead, they kept going. They kept going every day. And thousands of women started arriving in D.C. by train. They wanted to picket. And I didn't realize this, but this is the first time ever in the history of American history that anyone ever picketed at the White House, which I thought was kind of interesting. And it was women suffragists. And these pickets, they actually just used the words from the Declaration of Independence. They were saying, "We don't have a democracy. We don't get to vote." And things started getting a little more heated. And by this time, the U.S. has entered World War I, and people were thinking of suffragists as being unpatriotic. And so they were kind of against these pickets, and they started getting arrested. They started arresting the picketers in July of 1917, and they sentenced them to a workhouse. And if you've ever read the history about that, it was a pretty brutal place to be sent to prison. They were sent there, and they shared cells, not only with rats, but with other women who had venereal diseases. There was one case where the woman shared a cell with a woman who had leprosy. They shared their bathtub with people that had communicable diseases. So it was a horrible place to be. Some of the women actually participated in hunger strikes during their time at the workhouse. And the Marie Edwards, who was the Indiana Franchise League president, she actually sent a letter to the Muncie Franchise League, and she said, we are against these picketers. And I couldn't find any record of any woman from Muncie going there to picket. So I think a lot of the women from Muncie were a little more on the conservative side. There was one Indianapolis woman who got arrested. I found her, but I couldn't find anyone from Muncie. And actually at the same time that these pickets were happening, Carrie Chapman Catt had taken over the Susan B. Anthony suffragists, and she was actually meeting with President Wilson in the White House, and there actually was a woman from Muncie that participated in one of those meetings. So you have, again, the conservatives and the militants doing different things by 1917. But the good news is the news of these pickets, you see the newspaper reports here, actually started to change, and people had sympathy for the suffragists. They saw them getting released from prison, and they saw their condition, and they started having sympathy for the suffragists. So it actually did kind of work that they were having the conservative people talking inside the White House while the picketers were outside the White House. So it's a good combination of what was happening. And so that actually helped. And President Woodrow Wilson actually came out in favor of suffrage in January of 1918. So that was pretty important. So that was an important year. And 1918 for Muncie was kind of exciting because the very first woman who'd been elected to the U.S. House, Jeanette Rankin from Montana, she came to the fairgrounds on the 4th of July. And the fairgrounds, it's located where it is now. The early one was in a different location. But Jeanette Rankin came to the fairgrounds, and about 3,000 people showed up to hear her speech. And what they didn't realize was she had been making speeches on behalf of suffrage for about 10 years by the time she had been elected to Congress. And she was a very dynamic speaker. You can see her here. It's a very white, very male House of Representatives. And there's good old Jeanette Rankin right there in the middle. And actually, it's kind of interesting. The very first day that she was in office in Congress was the day that Woodrow Wilson declared war for World War I. So, and she was the one of the votes against it. So she actually bucked tradition and made a speech against the war that very first day she was in office. So she went in with a bang. And when she was at the 4th of July, she gave a really great speech about suffrage. She actually encouraged the women of Muncie to travel to Montana, where Montana had suffrage. And she said, you should go to Montana and fill out the absentee ballot there. Just say that you live there, and then just come back to Muncie and then mail in your ballot, and that way you can vote in Montana. So she was basically promoting voter fraud at the 4th of July celebration in Muncie. But of course, the newspapers, they just focused on the fact that they were so surprised that she wasn't ugly. And so the report in the newspaper the next day basically went into a big description about her appearance and how she didn't look manly and like a mean monster that they had portrayed the suffragists to be. So that was the 4th of July, 1918. And this is one of the parades that goes along. The suffragists during World War I, they would have these parades. They started sewing socks for the men. They would make bandages. So they were working as nurses. They were volunteering in the recruiting station. So the women really kind of amped up their efforts, and they were actually working in munition factories during World War I. So this was another thing. The war kind of slowed things down, but yet it also helped because the women were able to serve capably, and people saw that. And then another thing that slowed it down was the flu epidemic. So we're always hearing about COVID. In 1918, the flu epidemic actually affected women's suffrage. And it was kind of interesting because the state meeting, they had the state meeting in Indianapolis, but they didn't have the women from Muncie. They weren't able to go because Muncie had been shut down. They weren't even going to church in Muncie during that time. And the kind of interesting thing, that Marie Edwards that I talked about, that was the president of the Indiana Franchise League, she had just gotten back from Washington, D.C., and she was supposed to go to the Indiana meeting, and she had the flu. And she had the flu at the same time that Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the national leader, had the flu. And so they both had the flu and were recovering. So, and then 1919, this is kind of the last picket at the White House. We're getting closer to that 1920 date. These were called the watchfires. And this was something I didn't know until this year. I always assumed when I saw these pictures that these were those same picketers from back in 1917, but they weren't. They came back because President Wilson came out in favor of suffrage, but he didn't do anything. He just said, I'm in favor of it. So he didn't do anything. So they brought this urn and they burned his speeches every single day. And the kind of interesting thing is some soldiers rushed the urn and they tipped it over and attacked the women. So the women decided to take the urn and they went across the street to Lafayette Park and they lit the urn and they kept it going for 5 days, which is kind of interesting because that's where the tear gas happened this summer, was in that Lafayette Park during the protests for the Black Lives Matter. So there's a lot of volatile history in that park. And these women, there were about 26 of them, they got arrested. And there was one woman who was born in Indiana, and they went to that workhouse again. And when they got released from prison, Alice Paul gave them little jail cell pins. And the woman from Indiana, her jail cell pin that she wore is in the Smithsonian. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But this was another picketing exercise. And then obviously we fast forward to January of 1920. Another little known fact was the Indiana legislature wasn't in session. So in order for them to vote for the 19th Amendment, they said, we have to have a special session and that's really expensive. So the suffragists actually donated money to pay for that special session. And there were about 12 women from Muncie, including the Balls and Susan Ryan Marsh, who donated money for the legislature to be in session to vote. So they passed it in January of 1920. And then, as you probably all know, Tennessee passed by one vote in August of 1920. So that was the big battle for women's suffrage with Muncie. The interesting part, though, is some of the women that I thought in Muncie would be so adamant for women's suffrage really weren't. And so this is just one example. There's many examples, but this is one. This is Leslie Kitzelman, and she lived at that Kitzelman mansion that's now the parlor at Hazelwood. And she was a journalist. She came from Colorado. Colorado already had suffrage, and she was very progressive. Her daughter was the first teenage pilot in Indiana history. So that was like a really big deal. But Leslie Kitzelman actually came out and made a statement to the newspapers that she thought it was fine that women could vote, but she hoped that women wouldn't run for office because the women who run for office become almost like monsters. So I was kind of surprised. They always say never meet your hero, because I always thought Leslie Kitzelman would be really cool because she wrote some pretty interesting books, but turns out she wasn't that progressive. For Muncie. And then on election day, it was very, very snowy. It was an election day. It was very snowy, very cold. I have some pictures here from Indianapolis. It's the African Americans waiting in line. You can see they're all bundled up. And a lot of the women brought their children with them to the polls, and then they would just take turns like babysitting outside. Some of the franchise clubs went together en masse and voted together. The nuns from some of the Catholic churches went together and voted. They tried to vote early. In fact, the majority of the women voted before noon on election day. So that was kind of exciting. And it was the biggest turnout, not just for women, but it was the biggest turnout ever in the history. And obviously 26 million women were added to the polls. So that was pretty exciting. The unfortunate thing is it wasn't until the 1960s that the women became the majority voters. Again, we are a majority in population, but it wasn't until the 1960s that we were the majority voters. So it took a little while for us to find our feet. I do have some statistics though. Let me see here, in every presidential election since 1980, the proportion of eligible female adults who voted has exceeded the proportion of eligible male votes who voted. So women are obviously doing their part. And the exciting part on that election day was the first woman elected to the Indiana House was from Muncie, and her name was Julia Nelson. And the only reason why she was on the ballot was because the candidate had died the weekend before election day, and she was working at the Republican headquarters, and they said, who wants to replace them? And no one volunteered. So she said, I'll do it. And she ended up winning. So she was the first woman voted to the Indiana House. And you can see this is her quote after she won. Good gracious. And that's all she had to say. So that was kind of exciting. And just for a little motivation, this is from the 2016 election. This is a map that I use in my map classes. This is all the beige states represent the majority of registered voters that did not vote were the majority in all the beige states. So did not vote was the majority in Indiana in 2016. And you can see there's only a few states. There's several blue states, but very few red states. And all of those beige states where the majority of registered voters didn't vote. So hopefully we can be inspired by the women suffragists and how they fought for women's suffrage and be inspired by that. And if you want to check out, we do have an Instagram page that you can follow along with little stories that we post. It's called the Muncie Notables on Instagram. We post some pictures, some really cool photographs on there. But that's the end. I know that's a lot of information. I try to always fit in a lot of different stories. So if anybody has any questions.
I'm going to go ahead and ask to unmute.
Okay.
If people want to unmute. Or they can type in the chat if they want. But I do have a couple of questions. Well, for one, you mentioned the militant and the conservatives, and that they started getting violent with the picketers. Now, did you ever notice any like violence in Muncie? Did you ever find any violence in Muncie? Because it just seemed to be one big party.
Yeah, I didn't, and there wasn't any really controversial acts in Muncie. Like they were having parades, they were having picnics. But the thing that kind of concerns me about that though, is I wonder if we know. Because the woman who got arrested at the Watchfire in 1919, she actually kept it a secret. She had actually been to the 1970 picketing, but she didn't tell anyone. And when she got arrested in 1919, it was obviously reported in the newspapers. And she said, well, I was kind of concerned that my mother found out that I was being arrested outside the White House. So I just wonder if there were women from Muncie, but maybe we just don't know about it, and maybe their story hasn't been told. We're not sure. So,
okay. Did anybody else have any questions? I've got a couple, but I don't want to hog it. See, I think Daniel raised his hand, so if you want to go ahead and just say your question, that's fine. I think you're unmuted. We can't really hear you, so. You can type it in the chat too. I still don't hear him. He raised his hand. Well, if you want to type it in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and go on with my question. And then if I see something from you, or if you can get your audio working. So you mentioned the two African-American leagues. Do you know much about them? Because I remember seeing something that Minnetrista had posted, the Booker T. Washington one, but they were still doing more research on it.
Yeah, we found there were 19 charter members of the Booker T. Washington franchise, and we've found about half of their names so far. And it's kind of interesting. There's one family that had their mother and three sisters that were in Africa at the Booker T. Washington meeting, franchise league. We do have more information about them than we do the Whiteley League. The Whiteley League, we know that they had a huge first meeting that included men. We don't know if there were any men at all in the Booker T. Washington franchise league, but we don't have any of the names from Whiteley, which is kind of unfortunate. And we only get these names if the newspaper reports it. And they did put the Indianapolis Recorder online, and one of the African-American suffragists from Muncie, Nettie Riff, her picture was at the beginning. she actually wrote for the Indianapolis Recorder. So I'm going to go through, that's like on my list of things to do, to go through and see if I can find anything that she wrote that maybe she talks about their early suffrage meetings and mentions some more names, because right now we're just at 19 names.
Okay. I feel like Ida Husted Harper would be horrified that we're still fighting for equal rights.
Yes,
Right?
I think a lot of them would be.
Oh,
Yeah,
sure.
for
Just like
sure.
the vote would
Yes.
solve all our problems, but it really
Yeah.
didn't. And I feel like more people need to know about like all the violence that happens. I think there was a video we were talking about watching here in Farmland about, it might have been the same video you were talking about, like the working conditions or the prison conditions and that sort of thing.
And it's important to remember too that there was an anti-suffrage club too. And so there were a lot of women that were actually actively participating against the vote, especially like if you ever watch any of the movies about that last vote in Tennessee, they were all staying at the same hotel, the antis and the suffragists. And I just can't imagine being a woman, you're spending all this time and energy against women voting, but it's typical. I mean, today we see that today too. There are women that vote against the causes of women. So,
okay. Daniel did put something in the chat. So he said, I read somewhere that Ida Husted Harper destroyed some of the papers of Susan B. Anthony. Have you heard this?
I've heard that too, and I don't know what's real, but I do know that Carrie Chapman Catt, there were all these rumors about the early suffragists, and back then, obviously, it wasn't as progressive as today. Like Carrie Chapman Catt was actually involved in a lesbian relationship with one of the suffragists from Southern Indiana. And I think a lot of those things they were trying to keep private for obvious reasons back then. And so I'm just wondering if some of the papers that she destroyed are more related to personal correspondence with things like that. But the good thing is there are a lot of franchise leagues across the country that do have correspondence that she wrote to them. So a lot of people have added information to what Ida Husted Harper wrote. So that's the good news. But yeah, I've heard that too, that a lot of her papers were destroyed.
Going back to the anti-suffrage people, and you said that Leslie Kitzelman thought that women running for office would be monsters.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Did she?
Yeah, I have.
That more?
I posted this on the Muncie Notables. I posted her quote that she gave the newspaper. Her actual interview with the newspaper was a little more colorful. Let me see if I can pull up that posting really quick for her exact quote. Here we go. Yeah, so she says, I have no objections to women's voting if they let it stop at that. But when they run for office and neglect their homes and families, as some women will, they are not good citizens. A few hair-pulling matches among excited ex-ladies will result, as it did in Colorado, where suffrage developed a species of woman politician more objectionable than the male variety. And in a very few years, sane and sensible women lost interest in the vote in Colorado, is what she's referring to. It will probably work that way here. So she was saying that the women in Colorado that were politicians were pulling hair and getting into fights and being violent and militant, and I couldn't find any evidence of that. Yeah. So, yeah, that was Leslie Kitzelman. It's just interesting, though, because she wrote a book. It's called Reno Reveries, and it's about how you could go to Reno and get a quick divorce. And when you read the book, I'm like, oh, she's cool. Like, she's,
Yeah.
No.
That's kind of funny, actually.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads me to my next thing. So you mentioned flack from husbands. Did you find a lot of accounts about that in newspapers or in diaries or anything like that?
Well, May Wright Sewell, who was the suffragist from Indianapolis, she insisted that all of their early meetings were secret. And they actually gave their club a different name. And I did find some evidence of some of the clubs in Muncie that had strange names were actually meeting about suffrage. So, but I couldn't find any specific husbands, so to speak.
Sure.
But I think one example would be Dr. Hugh Cowing, his wife, Alice. And I'm trying to think of the AF Meeks Mortuary. Her name was Flora Meeks. And I think their husbands were maybe not anti-suffrage, but I don't think they liked their wives being involved. And it was kind of interesting because both Flora Meeks and Alice Cowing actually not only got involved in Muncie, they became state officers. And I think it was Alice Cowing that went to the 1920 National Convention. So as soon as she got her vote, she was very active nationally too. So they didn't pay attention to their husbands. So that was good.
That's funny. Were there any other questions? I don't see any more questions in the chat. Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, I guess that's it. I put a file for women's history, and then if you signed up for this session, I have your email. Daniel says thank you if you don't see that.
Thank you.
I have your email, and I think Melissa's going to send me a resource guide, or I can provide her with email too. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. This will also probably be on the YouTube if you want to see it later, because we tend to put our virtual programs up there for people to watch later. So, okay,
Cool.
Well, with that, thank you, Melissa, for
Thanks so much.
to do this, and thank you for a great audience.
Have a good night. Make sure you vote in November.
Yes, that's very important.